Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for being here tonight. It is absolutely a pleasure for me to be here. My name is Alesha Luxon, and I am, as you can see, a registered nurse. And I work with XDX, which is Expression Diagnostics and AlloMap. And the reason I'm here tonight is because I want to talk with you all a little bit about AlloMap. Some of you in the room are familiar with it. Some of you have heard some about it but aren't quite as familiar, so we're going to go over some information about that. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of background about me, because I heard a little bit about from all of you. As I said, I'm a nurse. I was a transplant coordinator for 23 years before moving into the industry, so to speak. And I worked mostly with kidney, liver, and pancreas transplants. So those of you on this side of the room who have gone through that, I absolutely can't say I know how you feel, but I understand a whole lot of what you've been through. And then I started with XDX literally just in April of this year, and I'm very excited to be a part of that growing little company, because I tell you, it's the more I learn about medicine and what's going on in the medical field, the more this personalized medicine, looking at genomics, is becoming a bigger thing, not just in transplantation, but in a whole bunch of other arenas as well. So we feel like we really are on the cutting edge of brand new technology and the way of the future. So we're going to talk about AlloMap, and then if you are interested at the end, I'll kind of switch gears, or we'll take a break, and then I'll switch gears, talk a little bit about the new guidelines that were just published, guidelines for the care of heart transplant recipients that were just published in August of this year. And I was just going to give you a little bit of information about that if you're interested, and if not, we'll stop at the end of the AlloMap thing.
And if I can just explain, as I explained to her, we're not here promoting a product, but it certainly is technology that's very exciting that we see. So we're going to use the AlloMap word, but at the same time I've asked her to focus on the technology behind it so we can see what might come to the future in other areas.
Absolutely. So here's just a timeline of kind of what's going on in the world with medical advancement relating to heart transplant, not just heart transplantation, but in kind of medicine in general. And you can see back in 05 was the first cornea transplant was done, way back at the turn of the last century. And then in 1953, the DNA structure, the double helix that some studied in school was discovered. But then the first successful heart transplant was not done until 1967, and there were some real issues with the success rates back in the early days of not just heart, but all transplantation because of the immune system. So the real turning point in terms of success for transplantation came in 1983 when cyclosporin was approved for use by the FDA. And that really changed the face of transplantation, because success rates changed from less than 40% in the first year to up to 80 and 85%, pretty darn dramatically. After that, a couple years later came Prograph, and then in 2003, the human genome was finally sequenced. And since that time, there have been many medical institutions, companies looking at the human genome, trying to figure out what can we do to tweak these genes, or at least look at the different genes to figure out what's going on in the body during a given circumstance. And that's where AlloMap, or gene expression, comes into play. And we're going to talk more about that. AlloMap was cleared by the FDA in 2008, and as I said, just in August of this year, there were new guidelines published for care of heart transplant recipients, and gene expression profiling, or AlloMap, is one of the recommendations in those guidelines, and we'll talk more about that later on. And by all means, this is a very informal presentation. If you have questions, feel free to just stop and ask me as we go through. If you're one of those that can remember it till the end, that's fine too. I can't do that, so I have to ask throughout. So what is AlloMap? AlloMap is a non-invasive test. By that we mean, unlike a biopsy, as those of you in the room know, that's pretty invasive. AlloMap is a simple blood test that takes one tube of blood, a stick in the arm, one tube of blood, and that helps your physicians and other healthcare providers manage your transplant care. It is clinically proven. It was developed and validated by clinical studies, and it's been available since 2005, and as I mentioned before, cleared by the FDA in 2008. and it's part of the guidelines as we just talked about. These are the indications for what AlloMap is used for. It is indicated by the FDA for patients with stable heart function. So if you just had a major league rejection episode, that is not the time to get an AlloMap. It also is approved only for patients at least 15 years old and those who are at least 55 days post-transplant. And so when you get your AlloMap, when you get your blood drawn and you get your score, your healthcare providers get your score back, it comes in a form that looks like this. The results are reported as a score anywhere from 0 to 40. The lower the score, the lower the chances are that you are having a rejection episode. We'll talk more about that. Your physicians look at the score and they interpret what that score means for you. And they also need to decide what their comfort threshold is in terms of a score for you. And for many places, not all, but that score is different depending on the time post-transplant that we're talking about. But they make those decisions, the physicians decide, make those decisions, and they get the results in a day or so and then report to you, whether you need to do anything about it. But I do want to go back because I do want to show you. So this person, their score was 25, but you can see it's this big number right here. If this is a person, this is obviously someone who's had multiple AlloMaps because the score sheet comes back with the scores longitudinal over the last year. So any other AlloMap you've had in the last 12 months, it's also reported on that same thing. So obviously you can see the trend, you can see if something jumps up or drops down, you can kind of notice over time what's going on with your AlloMap score. So what does it actually measure? AlloMap measures the change in your gene expression using a really incredibly sensitive type of tool called real-time PCR. It's this big, fancy, really expensive machine that measures individual cells and looks at the expression of different genes, whether they're getting upregulated different genes during a rejection or whether they're getting downregulated. All of that is measured with this PCR. And gene expression is the process of turning gene information into action. So if you remember anything about your science from way back in school, which I remember a little bit, RNA is where the gene expression really is. So the DNA holds the information, RNA transfers the information into actionable stuff, and then the proteins in your body actually do the work. So that's kind of the quick down and dirty, what does the AlloMap test actually measure? So the AlloMap test measures gene expression in 20 different genes. Some of those genes, 11 of them are actually informative genes. So some of them actually go up during a rejection episode, some of the 11 go down. The score would go down during a rejection episode. So for example, one of the genes that is measured is a steroid gene. And so if you are on a higher dose of steroid, then that's going to make that gene score be lower than someone who's on a lower amount of steroids. And so that's sort of how this all works, but they look at them all together to come up with a composite score. So they don't give you a score of each gene, you get one composite score. There are also 9 genes that are used for quality control, just to make sure that this test and the blood sample is accurate, that the test is doing what it's supposed to do, because these are quality control things to make sure that the test is a valid test, so that when you get a score from your healthcare provider, it has been through multiple quality assurance measures to make sure that it's an accurate test. So how does it help you, the person going to get stuck again to get it? AlloMap is not a standalone test. It is something that can be used along with the other things that your healthcare providers do when they take care of you in terms of clinical evaluation, seeing you in the clinic, checking blood pressure, all those things that they do when you get seen. This is another piece of information to help them give you the best care possible. It delivers an objective score and additional information, but it's not ever meant to be a standalone test. So I want to make sure that everyone hears that loud and clear. So just like, as I said, when you go to the clinic, sometimes you get a heart cath, sometimes you get an echo, sometimes you get a biopsy, you certainly get a clinical evaluation. Somebody's there actually looking at you, listening to your heart. And then you could get an AlloMap. It's another piece of the whole thing to give you information about how you're doing after your transplant. So a lot of people, including a lot of physicians, ask or assume that AlloMap can confirm transplant rejection. But this, for some people, is really difficult to understand. It's not that kind of test. AlloMap is more of, it helps identify people at low probability of rejection. So as I said, the lower the score, the lower the odds are that you are having a rejection episode. But it does not absolutely predict or diagnose rejection. It doesn't do the opposite. And some people want to think that it does, but it doesn't. And there's an example here that's pretty good. So if you have a motion detector in your house and the alarm goes off, is there a burglar in your house? Well, maybe. Maybe you forgot to turn the motion detector off and the dog moved and that set the alarm off. So in your history, the probability of the burglar actually being there is not 100% because other things can go on to cause the alarm to go off. But it makes you do something else to, the only way to know for sure is to go and go back home and check your house. And that's sort of how AlloMap is used. It gives you a low probability that you don't have rejection, but if your physicians and healthcare nurses, et cetera, are concerned, the only way to know for sure is to do that biopsy, but this can give you more information to determine whether you need that biopsy or not. Another good example that some of the men in the room might be familiar with is the PSA, that when you go to get a PSA check. That gives you an idea of whether or not you're at a higher risk for prostate cancer. It doesn't tell you that you have it, no matter what the score is. But if the score is higher, it tells you that you might be at higher risk, therefore you need to get a biopsy to know for sure. AlloMap works in a very similar way. Does that make sense to everyone? Is that clear? Okay, good. So who's using this? Some of you are from institutions here that are using, and some of you are from institutions who are not. Well, obviously, there's a whole bunch of people in the Northeast using this test, as you can see by the little dots up here. The red dots are centers that are actually using it, and the blue dots are centers that are using it with a protocol, who actually have draw sites, excuse me, not a protocol, but draw sites around there so that people can go get their blood drawn. So more than 7,000 patients have been tested. Now we're up to over 23,000 actual AlloMap tests done. So there's a lot of experience. It's not like, only 100 of these have ever been done. So how does this all work? So you go get your blood drawn. It gets packed, processed, shipped out to our lab in Brisbane, California, which is South San Francisco, basically. Run through the big, fancy, expensive machine multiple times with 3 different QA processes to make sure that indeed the test is accurate. And then the gene expression information is translated into that one composite score and then sent back to your physician or nurse's office, and then they interpret the data and then let you know what, if anything, you need to do further regarding the possibility of rejection or not. Just so you know, it's a bit of a challenge because we're on the East Coast and our lab is on the West Coast. So typically for folks on the East Coast, you're not going to get, your healthcare providers are not going to get your score until the next afternoon, because once it leaves here, it goes out there. It just, by the time they finish that 9 or 10 hour process that it takes to do it, well, it's already 7 or 8 p.m. back over here. So it's really almost always the second day that you would get notified about anything, just because of the difference in the time changes. Again, it's a multi-step process, and these are just some actual pictures of people in our lab doing those tests, but that's kind of how it works. gets sent out, takes 9 or 10 hours to do. The results get reported back as soon as they're done and verified, and that, which on the East Coast is usually the next night.
How is that transported?
FedEx overnight on dry ice. So where do you get tested? That's a big deal. So blood samples for AlloMap can only be drawn in labs that have been trained and are approved to do this. And as you start forward with this and as your institutions start forward with this, that they will let you know, okay, where are the draw sites where you can go to get this done, because that's kind of, in most situations, it cannot be drawn within the transplant center.
Is that still true around here? I know there was a big thing, and Second Chance was asked to support some argument to support the idea of it being done in the hospital, and I know
Yes.
some of the hospitals now do it, right? So are those here, am I right, or?
They do very rarely in the hospitals here, because that was a Medicare issue that Medicare said it can't be done at the same time, on the same day that you're there for anything else. That's kind of the bottom line. So that's why we had to set up these outside labs in order to get this processed, so that, because, you know, you don't want to go to the hospital one day, do all your stuff, and then have to show up on a different date and do only an AlloMap. So we just kind of moved it all outside of the hospital. And that's really only for Medicare patients, but it's one of those deals that it gets so confusing then for the people in the office, you know, not our office, but, you know,
Yeah.
your doctor's office, they're going, okay, do you have Medicare, do you not? Well, what about a supplement? It's just kind of easier to keep it all outside until we get this Medicare deal changed, which we are still working on. Has not happened yet. There is hope that some of the stuff that may or may not happen with healthcare reform, there would be a piece of that that would really push that to get changed, but it's still that way as of right now.
Any medical reason for separating the day, or is it
Not at all.
just there's no
Purely-
right?
It's
Gotcha.
purely a reimbursement reason,
Okay.
basically. So essentially, though, our plan for this area, just so you all know, is as more and more centers are talking about adopting this, is to set up multiple draw sites kind of surrounding the city, so that so you wouldn't necessarily even have to come all the way into the city if you don't live in the city to get it done, and you could go to a draw site near you. Now, there's not going to be 100 of them, but the plan is certainly to kind of start with one, add more, so that it's easier for everybody to get to.
So this is just a simple blood draw. I mean, any blood lab, if they were certified or something, could do it, right? I mean,
Once they're
between
trained,
Quest Diagnostic and LabCorp are the main ones around here.
Right.
Potentially, eventually, that could be one of their standard tests.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly. And we're actually working with LabCorp a lot. We actually just signed a contract with them to kind of, when possible, use them so that they are familiar with it. They're very used to doing it all over, and they are working hard to kind of meet our needs to figure out places and that kind of thing. So yes, that is exactly right. Okay. So insurance is a bit of an issue too, and I just, I don't want to belabor the point, but I just want to let you all know that some insurances pay for this just right off the top of the bat, others don't. Medicare does, as long as you don't do it in the transplant center on the same day, they pay just fine. Some insurances don't, some, and we're working on that as well. So occasionally, the insurance company might just want more information from your physician's office, just a letter of medical necessity or that kind of thing. But the other thing that we have done, because that is a big issue, and sometimes you get information from your insurance company that looks like a bill, and it's really not a bill, but so what we started doing is we have a patient advocacy team that actually works with everybody individually to kind of sort through all the insurance stuff. So someone from XDX or AlloMap, if you go to get an AlloMap, once you've started into that, somebody will call you and introduce themselves over the phone and say, look, I'm here. If you have insurance questions, issues, please call me. Don't freak out and call your transplant coordinator. Call me first, because odds are it's not a bill. It's probably an explanation of benefits, but we want to help you work through this. And we're trying to be much more proactive about it so people don't get alarmed for no reason. And also, it helps to navigate through the insurance process together if everybody's kind of on the same page. So we have an 888 AlloMap number, but for everybody in this area, in this region, Natalie Thurston, who is also a nurse, is the patient advocacy manager. And if you want to take a moment to write her number down, I will leave it up there for a minute, and I've also got, I think, one of her cards with me. But she's the one that will be calling you individually to kind of say, okay, if you have a concern, call me. If there's a problem, you know, if the insurance won't help, I may be calling you, so just to try to get all that stuff hammered out. And because of the guidelines and all the things that have happened just in the last 6 to 8 months, more and more insurance companies are paying, and more are taking a second look about paying. So it's getting easier. We're not over the hump yet, but it's getting there.
How expensive is the test, just out of curiosity?
The test costs $3,200.
Okay.
And it costs it's a lot of money. It costs XDX half of that amount to run every single test. So it sounds like a lot, but the technology is not cheap.
I know this is a little tougher question, but in general or on average, what is a biopsy cost?
It's funny you should ask that. So there's a lot of discussion about that among cardiologists who, you know, and it's really funny. Well, it's kind of a sad statement in my opinion. You're reminding me, it's on tape. The answer to that is incredibly variable from center to center, and you know, so if you ask that question in a survey, you know, people have tried to write a paper about that exact thing, and the answers that they get from different people within different transplant programs are all over the board. I mean, it's anywhere from $500 to $20,000, and so you go, well, wait a minute, you're not measuring apples and apples here. But no one's done a very good job at winnowing out, okay, let's really compare what are we measuring and what are we adding.
I'll ask the question a different way. What does Medicare reimburse for a biopsy?
Again, it depends upon who's doing it and what they bill them, basically. And I don't know an exact answer to that.
I thought, like, set fees.
Right, there's usually, you know, a certain specific amount or percentage or whatever. But that's a really valid point, because in your mind, you go, gosh, surely, to goodness, a biopsy is more expensive than that by the time you consider, you know, the room that you're taking up and all the different people involved in getting that biopsy done. But there's never been a great study thus far to look at that to see what it really is, what that number really is. So it's really weak. So therefore, you know, obviously we cannot therefore make the claim that it's less expensive than biopsy.
Okay.
Believe me, we'd love to be able to make that claim. Logically, it seems like it, but there's no data to prove that. Because the information given when you survey some people, it's just all over the place. Sure.
I know one hospital, and when I used to get the biopsies, and that was pretty recent, 5 years ago, it was over $60,000, but you have the doctor involved, you have everything. They couldn't just break it down and say the biopsy is.
Right.
What's over 60,000?
Yeah, right. And that's what I think. I think when in the studies that have been trying to look at it, some people take that whole big picture and go, okay, it's really over this, because that's really what it costs. Because they aren't going to do it without all those other pieces. It's just, you know.
Yeah, that's what I heard. What's the bill when a person goes in to have a biopsy?
Right.
You know, they don't get, you know, a bill for the Band-Aid and a bill
Right,
for
right.
You know, every little thing.
Exactly.
You see a big bill.
Exactly. But a good study hasn't been done to answer that question definitively. I hope it does.
Then, of course, you have the bill, and then you have what the insurance pays.
Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly.
Which, well, but the figure, the
Yeah.
3,200 is
Right.
Yep.
is also what
Well,
you do.
but those of you who've gotten a biopsy, gosh, yeah, you're right. Look at your hospital bill, and then you know in your case whether it's a cost-effective thing or not. Educational available, there's a whole, besides me getting to come around and talk with you all individually, which I'm very, very happy to do, there are a lot of other resources available to give you more information about AlloMap. You can always go to the XDX website, XDX, that's what it looks like. We also have an AlloMap website, allomap.com. You can download brochures from there, print them off. There are some brochures also in Spanish. We're working to try to make all the things we do in English as well as Spanish. And there's also an information sheet with the draw sites that are available. And what happens is when we set up these draw sites, we actually provide maps from your transplant center to wherever this draw site is so that you know where to get, and the transplant office will have those for you, so you can just grab one and go, and after a time or two, you figure it out. And then we also, as I mentioned on the AlloMap website, we've got patient testimonials. There's a section for patients and caregivers, other resources that you can go to about heart transplantation. And then there's also on the XDX website press releases, etc. And the other cool thing that just started happening, and there's also a place about getting tested and kind of what you need to do. And then most recently, just as of 2 weeks ago, we now have an AlloMap page on Facebook. So you can go to facebook.com/pagesAlloMap and check us out there. And it's interesting. We've gotten some decent hits on it, as they call it, as the lingo goes. And more people are starting to ask questions, make comments. So it's worth checking out on there, because that's obviously a big social arena. And it's not us writing the information, it's people out there in the cyber world. So anyway, you can check that out.
Do companies other than XDX do a blood test that tests probability of rejection?
No, we're the only ones. And it's only in heart transplantation. Certainly our goal is to make this very successful in heart transplant and then look at other organ types, other disease processes, etc. It's just, you can't just go, gosh, okay, this worked in heart, let's just use those same things and see how it works in kidney and liver and lung. You got to go through all the testing again, all the validation, looking at, okay, what genes really do matter, and you have to look at all of them basically and check it out and different, okay, what about in kidney rejection? Well, is it different if it's kidney and then pancreas rejection? So all of that stuff we want to do eventually. It just, that validation process takes a really long time because you just sort of shooting in the dark at first and kind of see what happens.
So at the present time, it is only approved by FDA with regards to heart.
That is correct. That is correct.
XDX, do they have a patent on that machine that they're using out in California?
You know what? I don't think so, but that's a really great question that I'm not sure. I can certainly find out. I think no, because the machine itself can look at other genes as well. We just use it to look at these specific ones. I think that's the right answer, but I'll clarify that and find out. That's a really good question. Never been asked that before.
Want to start your own business, Jerry?
Yeah, I was going to say Jerry will patent it.
Well, I can tell you, somebody's got a patent on it, that's for sure. It may not be us, but someone certainly
And
does.
just out of curiosity, we've had some other presenters about product technology, and they focus on a different organ because of the volume. Now, certainly there's a volume with heart, but why would you go for the kidneys? I mean, there's so many more kidneys. This test would seem to be more profitable if you could do a bigger base. Any idea?
And certainly, as I said, we want to. And, there were a group of researchers at Stanford who actually kind of started this whole process, and they happened to be cardiologists doing heart research, and they kind of said, I think we could be onto something here. So that's just where it started.
Good.
Most certainly, we would like to do that. Because you're right, there are more kidney transplants out there than hearts.
Yeah, but kidneys also don't have the biopsies.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
We have other tests that let us know that we're getting sick.
That's right. I mean, you can check a creatinine and a BUN and give you an idea of how this kidney is doing.
Right,
There's no
it's
lab
not the
test
same
you can
test.
check
Yep.
on your heart function, otherwise you wouldn't be getting all these biopsies.
Gotcha.
So that was the other reason. It was like, okay, and it's also when you're initially starting a research project like that, when you're looking at all these genes, it's a much more controlled environment to be able to answer that question. Okay, so here's what happens in heart rejection. We get this. Let's just focus on this first. And that's certainly the plan. Focus on this, do this really well, and then move on to look at other organs as well as, like autoimmune diseases and all those kinds of things. Just to make you aware, customer service is available almost 24/7, 800 number there. Anytime you have questions, concerns about AlloMap, about what's going on, if you have a complaint about the draw site, whatever, trust me, these people are fabulous, and they will address the issue, and there will be a whole process of paperwork and electronic work that gets filed to address any concerns, because ultimately, we want to assure you and your healthcare providers that the score you get is a valid score, and that there's no mistakes being made back in the lab to cause you to have a score that doesn't make any sense. So we take that very, very seriously.
Does XDX keep a history on each patient?
Absolutely. 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 Yes. Questions? Any other questions?
Just point out that it did say Pacific time there, just so you know. It's 3 hours difference there, so you're 9 to 8
Right.
Monday to Friday. How many have actually used this test in your hospital situation? Jerry?
Yeah, they did it along with a biopsy, and they told me in advance that it might not be paid, but that what I was told at that time was that XDX would pay for it if it wasn't paid. But this is years ago. This must have been.
Well, and to this day, we have never ever charged a patient for any of the 23,000+ tests that have been done. Now, I won't put in writing that we will never ever bill a patient, but we have not yet. Because we want to make sure that we're doing what's right for you, and what's right for you is giving you the information that you and your healthcare providers need to get yourself taken care of.
Now, Jerry, I'm sorry.
No, that's it.
Jerry, just out of curiosity, since you had it at one point, what were the guidelines? Does anybody know the guidelines over at Health today? In other words, what patients are they using it for? Are they still using it just to constantly validate it?
It had just come into being over
Okay.
there, and I was having so many rejections that they wanted just to make sure that there wasn't something genetically wrong with me.
I'm sorry.
When I had my transplant in 2002,
Yep.
I was told, asked to join the survey,
Right.
but I was told I was on the tail end of the original survey at the Temple
Okay.
Yes.
study.
Yeah, right, okay.
And I've never been charged for the test
Okay.
at all.
But do you have any insights as to what the guidelines, how they're using it over there today? Just out of
He
curiosity?
doesn't get biopsies at all.
Yeah.
I don't get biopsies
Right.
anymore.
After, how many years at Temple did they stop doing it? Or you're with
I'm with
now?
Hahnemann now.
All right, how many years did they stop?
They stopped doing biopsies at 5 years.
5 years, same thing as up there, okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know what Temple's practice is. So I was curious, I know it's been an evolving thing, and as each team gains confidence in the use of this test, I've been interested to see where they went with it in terms of how they used it in place of the biopsies to use a risk analysis and decide when they have to do biopsies. And, I mean, let's face it, everybody's experience with biopsies varies.
Sure.
And,
And rejection and...
yeah, so it can be, I love the idea of taking a blood draw instead of a biopsy, so this is right direction. Go ahead.
Yeah, Jerry, if you remember, was the results of your AlloMap, were the results in line with what you were expecting?
It was
Consistent?
with the biopsy. It showed I had rejection.
Good. And that's what they're looking for. How valid was it? How much can you trust it? So I didn't know how much it evolved over this past decade now. Wow.
Well, one thing that I didn't really talk about much is just in April of this year, a big multi-center trial, which the University of Pennsylvania was a part of, was published. The folks at Temple were involved with the first study done about AlloMap, called Cargo, and then the most recent one was called Image. I always name all these studies, all these cutesy names, but anyway, University of Pennsylvania was a part of that study. And those results were, that was a big multi-center study with over 600 patients enrolled, kind of doing the comparison. And those results were just published in the New England Journal of Medicine in April of this year, which I don't know how much any of you know about medical journals, but that's sort of the creme de la creme medical journal. So it was a very good thing, not only for XDX and for AlloMap, but for all the investigators from all those centers to have a journal, an article published in the New England Journal is something that most physicians never, ever, ever get done. So it's a pretty big deal.
If you like to read statistics, that's where you go to.
About anything medical. That's exactly right.
And that article was in the New England Journal this past April?
In April of this year, yes.
Thank you.
Now, we didn't have a chance to have you introduce yourself. We introduced everybody. Who are you and why are you here?
Well, my name is Yvette Clark, and I have an interest in this whole, I'm not...
What's your background?
Marketing and sales.
Okay.
So from records like an MRI facility, but I'm a volunteer here at the Gift of Life Federal Program. So when I was sent this email message, I thought it'd be good for you to participate.
Good.
Just find out a little bit more. I was interested in information, so I was a little bit more about it.
Please come have some food.
Have dinner.
Sign in. Unless there's another question at this point, is there? I'm going to suggest we take a quick break to come get some.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the International Society of Heart and Lung Transplantation, newly published in August of this year, Guidelines for the Care of Heart Transplant Recipients. And it was published, as I said, in August in the Journal of Heart and Lung Transplantation, which is the big heart and lung transplant journal. So these guidelines were created by over 40 writers, physicians across the country, as well as 8 other countries. And they were all, once the guidelines were put together by these 40 writers, they were also reviewed by outside physicians to make sure that they felt like these were valid things. So this was, again, a big deal, first time in 25, I think, or so years that there had really been guidelines published on how to care for transplant recipients, heart transplant recipients. The guidelines were divided up into 3 task force groups, and the first one was the perioperative side, so before transplant. What are the things that should be done for a heart transplant recipient before transplant? The second task force looked at the mechanisms, diagnosis, and treatment of rejection, dosing and monitoring of immunosuppression. So that's sort of, the majority of the big major things that you need to worry about post-transplant. Not all things, but especially initially post-transplant. Those are kind of the big stuff that you all spend your years after your transplant talking with your cardiologist, et cetera, about. And then the third task force looked at long-term care. So, things like vasculopathy, chronic adverse events from your immunosuppressive medicines, or some of the other medicines that you might be on that have caused some problems. Bone disease, psychiatric issues, and then just basically returning to life. And so this third task force looked at all those kinds of things.
Just out of curiosity, one thing that's missing off that list, which is an obvious concern for all of us, is the cancer. Why wasn't that on the list?
Oh, well, they considered that under the monitoring of immunosuppression and that kind of stuff, and adverse events, chronic adverse events. It was looked at in there, believe me.
Since they have bone disease separate, I just thought it would.
Yeah, no, they kind of lumped that into there. And I'm giving you kind of a really kind of top-line overview of kind of what they did and how they came up with these guidelines. And one of the big things that is huge in medicine these days is talking about evidence-based medicine. And there is a real push in medicine, as well as nursing, to make sure that you know why you do what you do and that there's evidence to back what you do. And so they broke these guidelines down into 3 levels of evidence. Level A means that there really are multiple randomized trials to compare this process A to something else and say that process A or thing A or medicine A or whatever it happens to be is really better. Multiple trials done to prove that. Level B means that, so obviously level A is the highest level of evidence that you can have because there have been a lot of studies done to prove that, yeah, that really is the best thing, whatever that happens to be. Level B is the next highest level of evidence, And there's been at least one large randomized trial or several smaller trials, not necessarily randomized or, maybe just in a single center did a study. But it hasn't been replicated in other transplant centers. See the difference? Makes sense? And then level C is expert consensus. So there's no real study that's ever been done to prove why you do what you do, but the experts just feel that, in our best judgment, this is what should be done. No studies done to prove it, but it's expert consensus. So the interesting thing about these guidelines, written by these 40 writers, is that most of the guidelines, so most of the things that are recommended for the care of heart transplant recipients are consensus-based. So it means that really most of the guidelines in this big 50-some-odd page document are level C, consensus-based, because there have not been trials done to actually prove that it's the best thing. Now that's not all bad. Don't take that as a horrible thing. We'll talk about that. So, and what I did was I just kind of pulled some of the recommendations of the many that are in there. I pulled one or two out from each of the areas. So I looked at Task Force 1, which is the perioperative, or just before or right at the time of transplant. And I looked at, and I kind of showed you something from each of those task force areas that had a different level of evidence, just to give you an idea of what it's talking about. So in Task Force 1, the perioperative care, recommendations on the donor-recipient size matching is evidence level C. So when you all were waiting for your heart, I'm sure they talked to you, we got to wait for the one that's the right blood type, it's got to be the right size. Do y'all remember hearing about all that when you were, those of you who were waiting for your heart? For kidney, it's not such a big deal, but for heart, they want to make sure that you get one that's the right size.
So they didn't do a trial by putting in the wrong size and people see what happens.
That's exactly right. So that's why consensus is not always a bad thing. Because you don't want to be the one who is in the trial who's getting a heart this big when you're not. That's exactly right, Jim. Oops, excuse me. So evidence level B, the recommendation for antibacterial prophylaxis or treatment. So should, at the time of your transplant, should they give you antibiotics just to kind of cover you for whatever? Some trials have said that it's not such a bad thing to do, that it's a good thing to do, but there's never been any big, huge, randomized, multi-center control trial. But there have been a couple, so that they gave that evidence level B. However, CMV prophylaxis, prevent you from getting CMV infection. The recommendation to initiate CMV prophylaxis within 24 to 48 hours post-transplant is evidence level A. There are scads of data out there to tell you that, yes, this is absolute. This is an absolute. There have been comparative trials done, and this just absolutely needs to be done, and there's a lot of data back there to support that. So those are just 3 examples from Task Force 1. Task Force 2, which again is the immunosuppression and rejection and kind of all the stuff that goes along with those things. Evidence level A is the use of statins beginning 1 or 2 weeks after your heart transplant is recommended, regardless of what your cholesterol is. And again, there are boatloads of studies out there to prove that this is the best thing to do. It has an impact on long-term survival. It's the right thing to do, period.
You know what's interesting about this one? I remember one of the drugs we had for cholesterol, and it's under control. Why we take it? And they said, well, they've found out that it keeps the arteries from hardening. I thought that's pretty cool. They learned that over time. And those of you know who Sean Dukes is, he got his heart transplant about 25 years ago now when he was 19 years old. And last fall, he had to get a second heart transplant at 25 years with his first heart because of hardening the arteries. They weren't doing that then. So example of something that's evolved and now part of the guidelines.
Right. That's exactly right. And you're right. All of these things have evolved over time, with or without consensus or studies to prove it. So looking at level C, the standard of care for adult heart transplant recipients is to perform a periodic endomyocardial biopsy during the first 6 to 12 months. Evidence level C, there's never been a randomized study to say that's the right thing to do. It's just what people had to look at. They didn't have anything else to monitor or gauge how your heart transplant was doing. So that's what they did. But nobody ever did the study to compare it to doing nothing. However, gene expression profiling, or AlloMap, can be used to rule out the presence of acute clinical rejection of grade 2R, that's just how bad it is in this case, for appropriate low-risk patients between 6 months and 5 years. So for gene expression profiling, there is evidence level B compared to level C for biopsy, and that's because there have been a couple of studies done, 2 big randomized trials done with gene expression profiling. So AlloMap or gene expression profiling was recommended as an evidence level B.
Let me ask a question there, if I may.
You may.
I've always understood that in most programs now, they stop doing the biopsies at 5 years. At that point, my understanding is the risk factor of going and doing a biopsy invasively versus the risk of rejection is such that it flips the other way. With something as simple as the AlloMap blood draw, where that risk of all the things involved in the biopsy aren't there, why is it not a test that's recommended beyond 5 years as a standard of annual testing, for example?
I have,
Because those 2 studies looked at patients between.
I understand if they did that, it made sense from that standpoint. It's something to compare it to, but
Right, and that's why, because you can't make a recommendation with a level of evidence B if you haven't done a study
Yeah.
of people 5 years and beyond. Now, if that study were done and it was found to be valid, then it would stretch out. But
Bill?
those 2 studies, the 2 big studies, look.
Right.
They didn't look at.
I understand why they would look at that.
Right.
Bill, you were about to say something.
yeah, this December I'll be 8 years out.
Yeah.
And since my 5 years when they stopped doing biopsies, every year I still have my AlloMap test.
Oh, okay.
I have it done annually.
So it's not part of the guidance, but that's what they do. And that makes sense,
But
okay.
is your annual part of the study
No.
No,
Oh.
a
So-
different study that's not
I
done
have
yet?
no
Okay.
idea.
Okay, because you had mentioned earlier that you were part of the study.
Yeah.
Initially.
that was before.
Okay, okay.
Hanneman does that. You're at Hanneman, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
they do AlloMap.
That makes sense then, okay.
And other centers do the same, and there's a lot of talk now in transplant centers about, do we really need to do biopsies after 5 years, after 10 years, after whatever years? And some centers are looking at, well, maybe we don't need to. But for those centers that are very conservative, that are used to biopsying, every year, almost no matter what, they're looking at this because they're not ready to make that quantum leap from, we've been doing a biopsy every year on everybody forever, to just stopping. Many people aren't comfortable with that, so they do what you do. They just make the AlloMap part of the annual evaluation, because at least it gives them another piece of evidence to go on.
I forgot to ask, the AlloMap, does that show cellular rejection?
Yes, yes,
So it's not involved with humoral rejection?
correct, not at all, not at all.
Because
Two
I've had
separate
that.
things, right. Oh, believe me, we get asked that a lot, because you're not the only one who's had
Well,
that.
let me just add something for those who, we keep talking heart here, and there's people in here that aren't familiar with heart biopsy. When, I'm going to sneeze in a second here. Understanding the heart biopsy process would give you some indication of how dramatic a change this is. They cut into an artery, send a tube essentially down and curve around into the heart, then put a biotherm down in the same place with a pincer on the end to pick off tissues from inside the heart 3 or 5 times. Okay, now, your arteries can be thicker or thinner, and it is not unheard of, for example, to try and make that bend and not complete the bend, in which case they puncture the lungs as well as the artery. Guess what? You got major problems. Same thing inside the heart. You're touching the wall of the heart. They're using technology to know that they are touching it, but if they touch it too hard, the heart doesn't like that. And so those things compared to, can I take a blood draw? Wow. So those who aren't heart people might appreciate a little bit more knowing that. That's
You can
what
also do through the thigh.
That's another way to do it,
Like,
right.
I'm 7 years out, I still had rejection, and they could no longer, I had so much scar tissue, there was no way for them to get there. said I had to go through my thigh.
When you first get transplanted, this is almost a bi-weekly thing for the first couple months, then becomes a monthly thing. And, some people really have major problems with others just sail through. So in the first year, I'm going to guess you have this biopsy process I just described done, I'm going to guess 15 times at least. And what's amazing about it is you don't even get undressed. You take your shirt off, you lay there with your shoes and pants on, they get through, sit up, they put a Band-Aid on your neck and hold it there a while and say, okay, we'll see you next month. I mean, having described the extreme part of it, that's what it's like. Anyway, I just wanted to add that so that people appreciate what this could be.
And may I add that years later, you get a vascular surgeon to go in here and dig out all the scar tissue.
Oh, geez.
So, it's not pleasant.
Yep. This is much better.
Yeah.
It is most certainly easier, I'll give you that, that's for sure. So just real quick, and we're really almost done, we talked a little bit about task 3 being long-term care. So looking longer term, the CF stands for corticosteroids, so steroids. Withdrawal can be successfully done 3 to 6 months after transplant in low-risk patients. So can you get people off steroids in 3 to 6 months, low-risk people? Evidence level B. Lifestyle modifications. I know you all get talked to a lot about lifestyle modifications, including weight loss, low sodium diet, exercise, all those things. Other appropriate measures to control your blood pressure. The level of evidence for that is C. There haven't been really great randomized trials, partly because people don't stick to it, so you can't do a trial if people start and then stop. If you're in the exercise arm and you quit exercising, well, you can't be used in the study. So, and that's what often happens in things like that. So the authors of these guidelines talk a bit about and acknowledge that there really are gaps in evidence. And there are some valid reasons for that. And number one, there's the numbers, as we talked about earlier, the numbers of heart transplants are really pretty small in the big scheme of all the medical stuff going on in the world. There aren't that many of you all out there. Trials are expensive and they're difficult to do, and sometimes they just aren't practical or risky. Again, do you want to be the one in the trial of checking a biopsy versus doing absolutely nothing after your heart transplant? No, you really don't want to be in that study. And then the other thing is, some of this evidence or some of the data you can extract from the generic cardiovascular population. So it doesn't really matter if you're a heart transplant recipient or not, or a kidney and a pancreas or not. Having normal blood pressure is a good thing. Having really high blood pressure is a bad thing. It doesn't matter whether you're a transplant recipient or not. So some of this stuff you can just extract from other just general population things. And the thing to remember about the consensus is it's expert. It's not just some random group of people sitting around going, I really think we ought to do this. These are physicians and nurses who have trained most of their lives to take care of people like you, and they have a lot of experience and a lot of background, and that's why they can make the decisions and that they make about what and how is best to take care of you. So what can you do? Maintain a good relationship with your transplant team. Ask questions, give them feedback, tell them what's going on with you. Educate yourselves and each other, which obviously the fact that you're here tonight is evidence to that. Not randomized trial, but evidence to it. And then really seriously consider, when asked, to enroll in trials. If they sound like reasonable trials that aren't crazy or stupid or dangerous, consider enrolling in, because it's probably going to help you, and it's most certainly going to help those who come after you, to help the physicians and nurses who are going to take care of those folks figure out a better way to do so. That's it.
Very good. Any questions in this area now? One of the things that we fail to remember, and I have to admit I've been awakened to this several times, we live here in this Philadelphia area in a very resource-rich environment. We have people like Alesha who come out without second thought. We've had surgeons come out and give their time. We've had Dr. Isaac come and sit here for
a whole session of presentation, come down and sit with the chapter and just, banter about his career and his experiences for an hour with 3 patients, for example. And so I sometimes forget that this is kind of unique, that we have this opportunity, and I'm glad you come out and take advantage of it. But in Second Chance, as an example, for those who aren't Second Chance members, right, we have 800 local heart transplant members. That sounds like a lot, doesn't it? The challenge every one of our chapters has is out of the heart transplants each year, HUP as an example, they do in the neighborhood of 50-plus heart transplants a year. We are lucky if we gain 2 members out of those 50. In other words, we're capturing maybe 4% of the heart transplant population in our heart transplant support groups. And we come together and we think, well, this is normal. This is 4%. The other 96% are home doing whatever they do, hopefully back out to work doing something like that and living a normal life. But I must admit, I always thought, well, everybody's functional like this. And then you find out that, well, no, that's not the norm. The study shows something else. So just appreciate it. And the other part of this, and I say this because Tom Gano's here, for example, donor families typically don't ever meet a recipient unless they get involved in Gift of Life. And if you're a volunteer here, you see them all the time, they see you all the time, you think that's normal. Doesn't every donor family get to see people who are the result of their gift? No, they don't. And as a result, you have many donor families that never see that opportunity. We take it for granted here.
We never knew anybody that was a recipient. And our first introduction was when we were asked to do a talk. It was at Thomas Jefferson during Donor Week back in 1989, in April of '89. That was our first opportunity to meet recipients. And that was like the biggest thing. Here's living, breathing people that are going on and enjoying the gift that they had. And so that was really our introduction to meeting recipients. And after that, that's when we really became involved and say, hey, this does help something. It does, what we've done does help something.
When we look at the TRIO chapters around the country as an example, there are very few that have the resources of speakers coming in, certainly not presenting at dinner like we had tonight, huh? And so, thank you for coming out, and we really appreciate it. And Alesha is a good example of it. Susan?
I have a question for Alesha. I found that very informative and very, very good explanation. Made a lot of sense and very clear to understand. The breakdown of levels A, B, and C, although, and obviously it's generic in a sense that there's a very clear, 3 different clear-cut levels. But is the reference of level A, level B, level C, is that terminology used? Like if I were to read about a study, would it say there was, level A testing? Okay.
No. And, that kind of construct was set up by the authors of these guidelines to give, because there is such a focus in evidence-based medicine, but other groups, in the liver world, for example, might call it something slightly different. But in general,
you just have to figure out which one it is.
It's pretty much, that's kind of how things are in general broken out, because they really want to know, is there really evidence to support this? So they might call them, but there's no standardized, verbiage yet.
Okay.
One of these days it probably will be, but there's not yet.
They call it guidelines. Who's following those guidelines? I mean, it's not mandatory.
It's not mandatory. They are recommendations. They're not mandated, they are recommendations. In general, though, most programs are going to follow them at least most of the time, because otherwise, why have them? If you're going to write a bunch of guidelines and spend a lot of energy doing it, no one's going to follow them, why do it?
Well, more importantly, these experts from all around the world are saying this is the right way to do it.
Right.
If you're not, you got to look and say, why not?
Would it be considered best practices?
Yeah.
Which is
Exactly.
Yeah.
what people look at.
Yes.
And I'd have to say in our world here, given the number of transplant centers we have, 43 in this region as an example, they're pretty advanced hospitals as opposed to, say, a hospital out in the middle of Idaho. And so they are on the leading edge. They're the ones who participate in these reports and share these experiences. So when you talk about getting off steroids, I'm 16 years ago, and they got us off steroids in 6 months, if they could. Not all patients could, but I mean, they were doing that 16 years ago, and here it is, a guideline now. Well, maybe it's been a guideline for a while, but not everybody can.
Well, and a lot of this stuff is being done already by almost every transplant center around. It just hasn't ever been put on paper. But you all know from the different places where you got your heart transplant or your kidney and pancreas or whatever, you know, they got their little protocol on how they're going to do things, and they tell you, okay, here's what you can expect. That's fine, you know. I mean, and this is just kind of putting all that together, trying to compile all of those experiences to say, well, you know, this really does kind of make sense for most people. And that, not all these guidelines are going to apply to every single person because they can't. You know,
general guidelines. Sean Dukes, for example, shared just recently when he was at one of our second chance meetings, that when he talks to his doctor from now 25 years ago, my God, this is a quarter of a century ago, he got his heart transplant, right? I mean, when you look at the history there, your late 80s, I mean, that's the beginning. And his doctor said, we didn't know what the hell we were doing, we were just shooting by the hip, you know, in those days. And even Dr. Eisen, when he was here, said very simply, he said, we've been over-medicating our patients for years. When we see rejection now, we don't over-medicate them, we watch, because the body typically can handle it. So we watch carefully and see what the body can handle. And so this is sort of a culmination. You said they haven't done it in 20 years, updated this?
right.
So they're finally catching up with gathering all those experience together in one place so that all of the doctors can look at it and say, huh, I knew about this, I didn't know about that. And if that's the general guidelines, more people believe it than not. True?
In '01, if you were waiting for a transplant, you had to stay in the hospital and wait.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I got an LVAD for a few hours. It was the noisiest thing. Now they have LVADs that they can put in, you don't hear a sound. And I met one guy that's been walking around with an LVAD for 1 year, still waiting for a transplant. And that just goes to show that modern science has really changed things.
It is hard to keep up with, you know, you can't keep up with the current iPhone, you can't keep up with the current stuff going on. And it's interesting, as I said, I was a kidney and pancreas and liver coordinator most of my life. And it seemed like for many, many years, stuff started in kidney first and then kind of spread from there to the other organs. But I will tell you that, and I've been in transplantation for most of my life, in the last 5 years, the heart world has taken and run with the new stuff going on in transplantation, with the LVADs, with AlloMap, because, I mean, some of these LVADs are, you know, as big as this. And the technology and the advances that have come really in heart transplantation in the last 5 years, more so than the other organs. It's really interesting. It really did an absolute about face from where it was even 10, 12 years ago. Pretty interesting.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think for hearts, it was always the thing about pumps. You know, gosh, if we can get a better pump or, you know, a replacement pump and fix all the problems that were there with the earlier pumps, then that was kind of always a known goal. With liver and kidney and pancreas, obviously there's a whole lot more than just a pump. There's a lot of other stuff, so, you know, you can't very easily replace those, you know, because there's so many other things that those organs do. And as, you know, microtechnology, I mean, if you think about microtechnology, you know, 10 years ago, we didn't even really know what that word meant. Mm-hmm. And now, you know, how small can you get it? No matter what you're talking about, you know. So those kinds of advances with the little teeny tiny microchips, those are the things that allowed in the heart transplant world, in the LVAD world, things to just keep on shrinking to where they really aren't so overwhelming.
Did you see the other day, I think it was just recently I saw this, they are testing microchips in the pills as a way of monitoring whether you're following the discipline of when you're supposed to take them? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm talking about size of a chip. I mean, get that down inside a pill that's not going to bother your system so that they can monitor it. Woo.
When I was transplanted, I had read that, and reminded me when I was transplanted 12 years ago, I was in a study that on my self-set bottle, every time I opened it, it recorded every opening. And I had to send it in, I don't remember whether it was 6 months in a year or 3 months and 6 months, but I remember I sent it in, and they were kind of amazed it was every 3 months for a year. I sent it in, and they were amazed at the accuracy. I mean, they knew that on Tuesday, January 13th, I opened the bottle at 9:05, at 12:13, and at 9:21. I mean, it was precise. The second or third time I sent it in, they were surprised I had opened it one time too many in the middle of the afternoon. And I said, and I remember that because I opened it when I take other pills, and I opened it and went, oh, damn, wrong. Yeah, and no matters, but I mean, it was tracked that precisely, and it used to be it was an oversized bottle, so it was a pain in the ass to carry around. But they've now miniaturized it to the point that it's in a pill that you swallow.
There's one other article that I just picked up today, and it'll be on the Second Chance website shortly, and I brought you a copy in case you weren't familiar with it. But the title is Predicting Heart Transplant Patients' Health Easier. It doesn't mention AlloMap, but it mentions the concept of monitoring inside the molecules of the body, the change, which of course relates to what you were just sharing with us here, as being something else they're testing. I'm not sure how it relates to AlloMap, but it sounded very familiar, and yet it was too general for me to see what the difference was. But, I mean, for those of you who have only been transplanted in 10 years, can you imagine saying that? Only transplanted 10 years? But when you look at our dinner dance, and there's almost a dozen people out more than 20 years when we honor them. I mean, and it's not just 20 years. 20 years ago, it was the frontier of this stuff. So you that have been transplanted more recently, man, there's no 20-year limit, You're going to be hit by a car before you're going to have a heart problem. And by the way, if anybody remembers or knows Sarah Henke, yeah, she just recently passed away. She got about 12, 13 years. She was 18 when she got transplanted. Didn't die of anything related to the heart or the lungs. Other issues. Looked like it was a blood clot of some type, which often takes people down. So anyway, the question isn't how long we live, is it? It's how we live for that life we have, be it today or how long. Alesha, thank you very much for sharing both the information and the... Oh, I forgot the recording was on that. Oh, wow.